Good morning. Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Stacy Pettyjohn. I direct the defense program here at the Center for a New American Security. I am honored to have with me today the Undersecretary of the United States Army, the Honorable Gabe Camarillo. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
This is a really exciting event for a couple of reasons. This is the first time we have live streamed in our new office on Pennsylvania Avenue. So we have an entirely new setup, and that is very exciting for us to be experiencing. But I'm also really excited about the topic that we're going to talk about today, which is the lessons that the Army has been learning from the war in Ukraine, especially with respect to the use of drones and how to defend against the threat of adversary drones, which was the topic of a recent report that I published, Evolution, Not Revolution, that you can get on our website. So this is going to be a lot of fun. We are going to cover a lot of ground. I am hoping to, and I'm going to actually do it, I'll restrain myself and include questions from the audience that is in person, but also virtual. You can pose questions on our website on the chat box or by using the hashtag if you're using Twitter or otherwise known as X. But you need to identify yourself. We don't take anonymous questions. So if you're online, I would encourage you to get those questions in early, and I'll try to incorporate them in the course of our conversation today. So all right, let's get into this.
Let's do it.
All right. What are the major lessons that you've learned from Ukraine, and how would you characterize the future battlefield based on what you've seen?
Well, first, let me begin by thanking CNAS for inviting me. This is a great opportunity to discuss what I think is a very timely and super important topic. So let's get right into the question. I think what we're seeing, and not just in Ukraine, but really around the world, is that the availability and the impact of small unmanned aerial systems and the threats that they present on the battlefield is here to stay. As the premise of your study suggests, it is an evolution of a scale that is rapidly increasing to change the battlefield. So in a nutshell, what do we see? We see that the threat is complex, it's ubiquitous, and is really transforming what the battle space looks like. It is very difficult to remain concealed in this environment. It is a very contested and congested battle space. We know that electromagnetic signature, the availability of ISR capabilities brought about by these UAVs really prevents any forces from being largely concealed or massed together. So it's changing the way that, at least in Ukraine, both sides are fighting, and we anticipate it will change the character of how warfare is conducted in the future.
Yeah, that's a pretty dramatic shift. If you think about how the U.S. military fights, we've had a lot of intelligence. We've had a lot of really sophisticated, good drones like the Reaper, the Predator, the Gray Eagle that the Army has. But that information has been piped to headquarters, right, versus being down with troops on the front line. And you're seeing that there is a shift. I'm glad you agree with me that it's an evolution, though I'm always open to debates because I do think there is a fundamental transformation underway.
Yes.
But it's important to be measured in terms of how we characterize it and not sort of over-promising and exaggerating what we're seeing. There's clearly a lot more transparency on the battlefield. It's really, you're seeing with any vehicle that approaches the front lines in Ukraine is
right,
pretty much hit by a first-person view drone or something else now. But that transparency only extends so far. And that's one of the limitations with the jamming that's going on and just the limited capabilities of the drones that the Ukrainians and the Russians are using. So how do you think the battlefield would be different for U.S. forces, either because of the capabilities and the way that we fight, or where we would be operating?
Yeah, so I think what's important to note, and I don't dispute the premise, I do think it is an evolution, not a revolution, but I think that what I was alluding to earlier is the pace of that evolution is accelerating. And so what I think is interesting is not just the dynamic of move and counter move brought about just within the operation of these small UAVs, it is how it changes the environment that all forces have to operate in. So where I think it's most transformational is that we can safely assume, looking ahead to the future, that really low-cost, mass attritable sources of ISR are going to be available in any battle space. So what does that mean for our forces? We have to be prepared to operate, move, and to be able to maneuver within that environment. So that changes how the Army would operate in a combat environment as compared to how we did it in Iraq and Afghanistan for about 20 years. So one of the changes that we've recognized, for example, is we have to have lower signature, reduced signature from the electromagnetic spectrum. We have to be much more mobile. Large command posts with these large antenna farms that were easily discoverable for so many years is just not feasible, I think, in the conflicts of the future. And then also, in addition to that, I think it's recognizing that we need to be able to have a resilient access to a network for transport, to share data and information across the battle space when it's going to be much more congested. I think the advent of the UAV threat, it contributes to that complexity that it creates, but it's also there from other sources as well. So I think that's where the real transformation comes in.
Yeah, those are really excellent points. I think that, we're seeing that it is a very lethal battlefield, but you can survive. You have to be dispersed. You have to take measures to defend yourself and to conceal your position. And, obviously offensives are still possible. Despite that, we're unfortunately seeing the Russian troops making some gains recently, though they've been pretty slow. But it's important also to note that there's no one technology. It's not just about drones, right? Drones aren't the decisive capability here. Neither side's winning or has won, and they both have a lot of drones. It's not sort of one silver bullet. It's connecting the drones to other capabilities, the way that they've been linked to artillery guns and then to rockets, to missiles. That has really had an outsized effect on what you're seeing. So you hit on somewhere I wanted to go with speed, because speed is something that the Pentagon is not necessarily known for. Right? We first encountered the small drone threat in Iraq, like in 2016 in Mosul against ISIS. And it was recognized that this was a problem, and it was really challenging to figure out how to actually defeat these small DJI drones that were dropping bombs on Iraqi partners. The Air Force struggled with it. It took some time. And we've been working at it. We established the JCO in 2020 and have noted that this was the threat. But how are we going to accelerate our ability to counter it and to employ it and to adapt to the changes that we're seeing, which are happening so quickly right now?
It's a great question. And, I think it is one that shows the potential that we have to move very, very quickly with support across the Department of Defense and a lot of support from Congress. And I think it also shows the size of the threat and how quickly it's adapting. So even in areas where we're doing well, it is the change, or I guess I should say the pace of change, is still rapidly accelerating. So counter-UAS and what we're doing about this threat, I would say, has been a major focus area for the Army and really for the department in the entire nearly 3 years that I've had the privilege of serving in the Pentagon in this administration. So I would just start by saying this. There has been a lot of investment in this area by the Army. I went back and I looked at the numbers. So between FY17 and FY24, the Army's invested about $1.8 billion overall. And that includes a range of different approaches to countering the threat. That includes kinetic solutions like our programs of records, MLIDs and FSLIDs. It also includes the investment in the maturation of directed energy solutions. That includes high energy lasers, high powered microwaves, RF systems, for example, and how those are coming along. And it also includes the upgrades to the components, because a counter-UAS defeat system, it can have a kinetic or a non-kinetic effector, but it also has a sensor, a radar, it has a command and control system. Depending on the DE solution, you may have other components, thermal and power control, for example. And we are working along all of those lines simultaneously to get after it. I would say that because the threat is so current and real and clearly affecting, or presenting threats to forces even today, we have had to accelerate and put a lot of emphasis on what's available now. So if you look even last year and this year, we've been able to buy, for example, a significant quantity of Coyote interceptors, kinetic solutions to kind of defeat these threats. Simultaneously, we have made a steady amount of investment in our budget to ensure that we're maturing those directed energy solutions that offer the promise of what we've all looked for quite some time. How do you change the cost dynamic where you're not firing a kinetic interceptor against a very low-cost threat? So we're continuing to mature those. But those are developmental efforts. They take time. We have been successful in getting some prototypes out, and I think we're beginning to learn a lot from those. But there's still more work to be done. But the main thing I would walk away from is, there has been a lot of investment and focus in this, and the Army, I think, has had one of the leading roles across the department, both within the Joint Counter-UAS Office and really in kind of inculcating solutions within our programs of record.
Yeah, you hit on some really important points about the threat today and then thinking about the future threat. And I think that the U.S. military as a whole has had a tendency, when there hasn't been an urgent need right now, to focus on the future, the next thing that's going to be great. Directed energy has been something that we've been developing for a long time, and it holds tremendous promise in terms of being able to reduce the cost per shot and have deeper magazines available. But we also, obviously, what we've seen in the Middle East and elsewhere, we have threats that you have to deal with today and need to find a way to flip that cost exchange ratio so that we have solutions that work but also don't cost millions of dollars. And Coyote is a good, pretty affordable interceptor. I think it's interesting with what we've seen in Ukraine too, where American industry has innovated with things like the Vampire, where they're repurposing guided rockets and putting them on the back of trucks. Is the Army pursuing some of these current lower tech systems to gun-based systems, things that could really provide an affordable option for defeating these threats today?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of experimentation, and I'd like to see that continue well into the future so that we can continue to innovate at different approaches. It's important to remember that the UAS threat is kind of a close-in layer of a layered air defense problem the United States Army has always had. The threat is relatively new, or proliferated in this sense, it's relatively new, but we're comfortable tackling air and missile defense threats for quite some time. This is just a new version of it at a closer range. And I think the range of solutions we have to explore to get after it have to continue to be varied. So you mentioned DE, and we talked a little bit about that, but there are other approaches to it. And if you look at, for example, our programs of record that kind of tackle this, even those programs, in addition to these kinetic interceptors, they have things like handheld solutions, RF jammers, other ways to kind of get after this threat, depending on what's coming at you. And what we're seeing in Ukraine is what happens a lot when you have contact in an operational environment, a lot of innovation, whether it's low-cost things like a 50 cal kind of rifle shooting down some of these drones cued by a radar sensor. There's different ways you can experiment with existing capability to kind of begin to defeat the threat. Our focus, I think, has been in placing bets in a lot of different areas and continuing to mature them, while at the same time making sure we're prioritizing force protection for our soldiers and ensuring that, regardless of cost, that's always going to be job number one.
Yeah, no, that is good to hear. The air defense problem is and has long been the Army's mission in terms of ground-based air defenses, and clearly is another lesson that's emerged from Ukraine is how important and how effective these can be if they're mobile and if they're used in a really smart way. But the problem is really big because we have to defend everywhere. You have to defend maneuvering forces, you need to defend headquarters, Air Force bases, and across the full spectrum from ballistic missiles or hypersonic threats down to tiny little UAS.
And I would say that adding to the complexity is we have both fixed sites and mobile forces that we have to defeat all of these range of threats against. It's very different problem set when you have a relatively fixed site and you're not worried about moving the equipment around, as opposed to making something mobile with forces that, as we just talked about, have to be mobile in this really contested environment.
So you mentioned like handheld jammers, and this is obviously another area where the war in Ukraine is incredibly active, with the Russians having invested a lot over many years in a range of different electronic warfare systems, and Ukraine recently has acquired some more. They've had some of their own, so the jamming environment is just pretty dense and has been since the front lines have stabilized. What is the Army doing beyond some of the handheld systems? Are you looking at more of a layered approach to electronic warfare too?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, one of the insights I think we can probably safely make is that, UAS and the threat is inextricably linked with electronic warfare moving forward. So we know we're going to operate in a very contested environment. We know that the jamming problem is going to be with us for, to stay, mostly because the enemy has the ability to, in mass, propagate, the sources of kind of the jamming and EW threats that we currently face on the battlefield. So how do we respond to that? I think, pinpoint solutions to kind of counter the jamming, it's a cat and mouse game, right, between the enemy. And so I think that is successful only to a point. I think the other way you counter it is we have our own mass. So as we employ UAS systems for ISR or surveillance capabilities, you have the ability across a range of capabilities to be able to flood the zone. And then I think in addition to that, and this is equally important, we have to be able to operate within that denied environment or jammed environment, irrespective of what the enemy provides. And I think that's a big area of focus for us to make sure that we can continue to conduct our operations.
Yeah, absolutely. It's clearly going to be something that we will experience, I think, on future battlefields against sophisticated adversaries. One of the solutions that the Ukrainians are pursuing to jamming, and that is a logical one, is more autonomy in the drones. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't have that control link that is tethering it to a person, then that isn't a vulnerability that can be severed. And we've heard about, with the first-person view, the little kamikaze quadcopters that are crashing into targets, that the Ukrainians have been trying to develop a rather simple form of autonomous terminal guidance to help ensure that they can complete their mission and their flight. That was one thing that I think there's a little bit of hype in Ukraine about how much autonomy. I don't think it's actually very pervasive on the battlefield. Artificial intelligence is being used at higher levels in command headquarters to help with targeting processes, but we haven't seen truly autonomous drones at scale there. How are you and how is the Army thinking about autonomy going forward?
I would share your assessment, and I think it's important to say that providing a capability in mass and to be able to use AI and ML for essential target recognition, that's not the same as really operating as a swarm where there is collaborative autonomy that enables you to achieve effects on the battlefield. I think everyone's pursuing that, and I think that's kind of the goal everyone seeks. I think for the Army, it is an area we're absolutely investing in, and I think here it's important to note that how are we buying UAV systems to kind of meet this requirement? I think even over the last year, there's been a lot of change in the Army, from directed requirements, acceleration of programs of record, the opportunity to do much more experimentation with individual units at battalion and below to get after what's commercially available. And it goes from like a 1 kilometer to a 30-kilometer range. How can we employ them and use them? I think a big part of that is, us being more of an active buyer, and I'd love to talk more about what we're doing there within the COTS UAS space. My hope is that it will stimulate further investment and development on the industry side, and it will create some changes. Where we would like to see those changes go will be heavily influenced by the feedback that our operators give as they begin to experiment with and employ them. And that's where I think autonomy can help. I think it's important for the UAS developers and the software developers to understand what we need, how they would be employed, and really how does that fit within the architecture of how these UAS systems are built and designed. One thing I like to say is, if you look ahead to the future that the Army would like to see in this space, we'd like for these UAS systems that we buy to be low cost, attritable. We'd like for them to be configurable in terms of a payload, such that it doesn't really matter in the future whether we're putting EO/IR imagery, whether we're putting a kinetic effect what we're doing on the EW side, we'd like to be able to plug and play relatively quickly. And then again, I think there are software-based hooks to enable some of the autonomous operations you're talking about. It's going to take a while, I think, for industry to get there, but the best way to do it, other than just saying it, is by being an active buyer in the market. And so that's where I think we're pivoting over the last year or so.
Yeah, there's definitely a need for American industry and trusted allied drone industry to expand because China so clearly dominates the market, and in particular DJI and Autel. So figuring out how what you're doing can support that. Are you thinking that commercial drones will be actually employed by American troops, not just in experimentation, but on the battlefield?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that there is a lot of interesting activity by the commercial market. And again, they continue to iterate on their designs as well. So one of the things that we've done, even in the last year or so, is recognizing that units were already experimenting with low-cost commercial drones. Third ID and 25th ID in Hawaii are two examples of that. We said, how do we scale this idea out and kind of make it available to other units across the Army? Because it's COTS and because it's readily available, we used an enterprise contract called the Common Hardware Systems Contract. It's typically what we use to kind of let units buy modems and servers and routers and switches, other hardware technology. And if it's a DIU Blue List approved UAS system, we put it on the same contract, so units can just basically use their funds to buy it. That's going to be good because it will send a demand signal to the COTS vendor base about the Army being a large customer. In addition to that, I think it will also give some feedback to those companies about how they're employed and the things that we want to have in the architecture.
That's great. Are you also, since we're on drone categories and types, is the Army thinking at all about the FPVs? That's the super cheap loitering munition. It's really pretty jerry-rigged, what they're doing in Ukraine. Or I know the Army has loitering munitions now, though they've mainly been used by special forces previously. Is that something that you imagine is going to be more broadly employed?
Absolutely, and in fact, we're setting up programs of record to get after what we call launched effects, which includes the loitering munitions and more of the COTS UAVs. I do see these areas converging over time, so that, as I said earlier, whether you want to use it for with a one-way attack with a kinetic capability, or you want the launch vehicle to come back to you after generating or conducting an ISR mission, we'd love to see the world kind of evolve to where they're more interchangeable from that perspective at lower cost. And we are doing a lot on the loitering munition side. In fact, we have a directed requirement right now to get after that capability. And one of the things we're doing is experimenting with some of our brigades right now to kind of give them not only these launched effects and COTS UAVs, but to allow them to kind of figure out and train how they would use them. General Randy George, the Chief Staff of the Army, calls it transformation in contact. And really what it is, it's taking 3 brigades that are deploying or going to large-scale exercises and giving them these types of kit so that they have an opportunity to figure out how would they employ them. It will give us a tremendous amount of feedback.
Yeah, it gives you the opportunity to be building the plane, flying it at the same time, and have that really tight connection loop that they do in Ukraine, because if you don't get user feedback, that's where oftentimes technologies fail and where they don't transition and where a service decides not to buy them. I want to remind folks online, if you have questions, please submit them. I'm keeping an eye on things, and we're going to be turning to the audience before too long. Let's talk a little bit more about the particular drones that the Army is looking to buy. You've mentioned several different ones. There was the announcement this year that the Raven and the Puma, which were sort of these capabilities that the Army's had for a very long time, are going to be retired, and you're looking to the next generation of systems to equip the different maneuver units with. So where are you going? And in the budget, I saw that a bunch of the unfunded priorities on the top of the list, but still on the unfunded priority list, were about some of these small drones. So how important are they really?
It's super important. And I would just say, to tell the whole story, you've got to look at all of the programs of record and directed requirements that we currently have in this space. I think you've also got to look at what we've been able to do with supplemental funding, even this most recent supplemental bill, in addition to the congressional ads over the last couple of years as well. Let me just begin by saying, if you look at it by echelon, we had kind of a division and core level capability that's been around for a long time in Gray Eagle. We have a program of record, Future Tactical UAS, to kind of get after that replacement. We recognize that, just given our funding constraints, it hadn't really been accelerated. We're looking to make sure that that thing gets kind of on track. And I give the team a lot of credit. I think they're in, kind of evaluation right now at looking at different vendor teams to do that. Below that, there's a range of requirements that are emerging, whether it's long endurance ISR, and it could be through UAVs or other high altitude platforms. There are the launched effects that kind of get at kind of extended ranges. And then when you get to essentially like the battalion and below, that's where we didn't have a whole lot in terms of formal programs. But now we've got programs of record that are kind of either already formed or in the process of being formed. One of them, for example, is SRR, MRR, and LRR, different ranges, right, at that battalion and below level to kind of get at these COTS capabilities, or capabilities can be developed very quickly to put them in the hands of the users. I think a lot of the experimentation that we're doing right now with different brigades and different units will help inform some of those efforts. But I think most importantly, we see it as not a one-time buying event. I think the important thing to consider here is, because the technology is adapting so quickly, as we convert some of these to programs of record, our challenge is, how do we make sure that we can iteratively buy flexibly, quickly enough to be able to keep pace with the evolving technology? And as I've talked about before, it's very easy to start up programs. I think some people probably disagree with that. Sometimes it can be very hard to start programs, but it's also exceptionally hard to pivot programs, to make sure that, whether we do tranche buys, how do we pivot to that new capability as it arises? So whether it's counter UAS or UAS, I think that's the bigger institutional challenge we have to overcome.
Yeah, there's a lot of capabilities that are clearly needed at all of these different levels. When you think about sort of how you're going to process the information and who's going to retain the information, I'm curious what the Army is thinking right now. I know with multi-domain operations or joint all-domain command and control, the idea is to eventually be able to fuse all of that information into a common operating picture and share it with everyone in real time. That's probably some ways away. In Ukraine, one of the reasons that I argue that we're still in an evolutionary phase is the information really is still fairly siloed. You have some units, maybe up to the battalion level, that see what's going on at their headquarters from some of the small UAVs that they're using. But it's not shared all the way up, and it's not shared horizontally, so you haven't quite had that effect where everyone knows the same thing at the same time. Unless you involve machine learning or artificial intelligence, it seems like there's just going to be too much information. You can't just have so many screens in your headquarters or like an air operations center like you would with the MQ-1 now. So are you thinking that some of these capabilities are going to be retained at lower levels and selectively the information will be shared up, or what's the plan?
I think it's a great question. And, the reality is there is information overload in the battle space today, just given what we talked about right now. The next level question is, at what level what information do you need at what level that would be most germane to that echelon? And I think the Army is kind of working its way through that. So not everything you have with tactical UAVs would probably be relevant to the division level, or certainly not at the theater level Army. Some of it might. And so I think the first order of business is making sure that we have the right tools to rapidly analyze and process and exploit kind of that data, and make sure that we can make those decisions with people making the right judgment calls. And we have programs of record and capabilities that are enabling us to do that, that are in development and prototypes being fielded. Then I think above that, I think the question becomes, How do you make sure that you can share the relevant information at the right time in the right place? That is the broader department's question about joint all-domain command and control and how the Army fits into that. Again, if you look at it from a joint force perspective, our kind of data node, if you will, would essentially be at the division level of action. So making the right judgment calls, disseminating the information to the joint force, whether it be battle damage assessment information, enemy locations, et cetera, we will figure that part of it out. I think the two key enablers are making sure that we have access to all the full range of ISR capabilities for surveillance. And I think in addition to that, it's making sure that we have the right tools to process the information very, very quickly.
That makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to ask one question before I start to bring in the audience.
Sure.
And just to let you all get ready. You've mentioned mass. We've talked about how drones are needed at all of these different echelons. We need a lot of them. I just saw a CRS report recently that talked about, I think the Raven, it said we had purchased 4,000, which seems so small and so few compared to the 10,000 that RUSI reports that the Ukrainians are losing monthly. And obviously, the number we can buy is going to be tied to the cost.
Right.
And you've talked about some of the ways that hopefully, if industry were to pursue modular systems and look at the defense market in addition to the commercial market, we might be able to drive this cost down, because right now, price really does matter to have a lot. How many are you thinking of buying? What's your sort of acquisition objective in a ballparky fashion for all of these systems? And then how are we going to afford it?
Yeah, I think we're doing all the work right now to really be able to define that with specificity. And let me explain why that's hard to say up here on stage. You're right, cost is absolutely a factor, but we also know that the technology is changing very, very quickly. And the cost for some of these COTS UAS systems is actually coming down. So I mentioned earlier how we want to see the market evolve. And I talked about providing an open architecture both on the software and the hardware side for both payloads and collaborative autonomy, for example. A third area we'd love to kind of help see the market evolve to is to kind of enable more, for example, 3D printing of components, whether it's the drone frame, the blades, certain components, that you might be able to reduce the logistical footprint that would be required to employ them in austere settings. So Third ID, for example, is experimenting with some of those capabilities. But the market doesn't the COTS market doesn't really work that way today. So I think those things will also have a bearing on how expensive these systems are, not just for initial procurement, but over their life cycle. And the life cycle, of course, if you're employing them in mass, could be very, very short windows. And so I think how we look at that right mix, we're doing those assessments today as we're kind of working on these programs of record.
That's good. And you can tell I'm out of practice. I haven't done one of these events in a while because I was looking at the wrong thread in Slack for the questions.
It's an Air Force question coming my way, right?
No. Well, we had a question from Matthew that was talking about how quickly the cycles of adaptation, and you were just speaking to this in terms of looking at changing sort of the acquisition process. And then Cecil has a question on a topic we haven't hit on yet that is really important. How are we changing training at the operation and tactical levels to counter adversary drone activity? Frequently, we invest in capability, but how are we having this into an integrated operational approach?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to that answer. I think first, we have done a significant amount of work, the Army has over the last couple of years, to really update and institutionalize training against the persistent UAS threat. So one example of that I would note is Joint Counter UAS University, a training area that's been set up at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, to kind of get after some of this institutional training that has to be done across the force. And I would say it's joint because we have training seats available for all of the services. It's not just uniquely Army, so it's a really joint capacity. The other thing I would say is, as you look at that threat moving forward, it's not just, for example, the air defense community that's going to have to contend with it. It is, really all soldiers within all formations that are going to have to contend with that threat moving forward. So I think as we explore the continued evolution of counter UAS capabilities, it has to be grounded in a reality that different operators with different levels of background should be able to use them. So where does that come into play? So I mentioned earlier some of the command and control systems that we're currently using for our counter UAS systems. They're very much developed by the air defense community. So in the future, you could envision C2 systems that are optimized for different types of soldiers in different levels of the formation employing these systems. Just as it's getting easier to use COTS UAVs, we hope that it becomes easier to use some of the counter UAS capabilities over time.
Those are really good points, and tying it back to Ukraine, you've seen there's a huge difference between just sort of your typical soldier who's employing a DJI Mavic 3 and the really specialized units. And the specialized units, are highly skilled and have been going at this day in, day out.
Right.
And what's really interesting is how they can accumulate knowledge. And they are at risk because a lot of these drones are short range, but they are somewhat removed so that they can lose the airframe and still survive and learn from that in a way that actual pilots don't normally have that luxury. So, but not everyone needs to be that skilled at operating all of the drones. You want to be able to actually tailor it to the level people are at. All right, are there questions from our in-person audience? Zach, can you please introduce yourself?
Is it working? Yeah, good. I'm Zachary Kallenborn. I have an excessive number of titles, but I'm a senior researcher at Looking Glass USA. Thank you all for the chat. That was really interesting. I noticed that most of the focus in countering UAS was on the defensive side. I was wondering if you could speak more to what the Army is doing in considering in terms of offensive countering UAS. I mean, identifying, targeting pilots, targeting production facilities, training facilities, that type of thing. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I can't get into too many details that get very classified very quickly. I would just say that it is an across-the-board effort by all of us in the Army and certainly across the department to get after those sources of threat. That includes everything you just mentioned and more. What I would say is, just given the rapid technology cycles, the proliferation of vendors in the industrial base across the globe that are producing these systems, and how they are hardened, for example, against jamming and EW, it is getting increasingly difficult to look at defeating them that way. So I think that looking ahead for the Army, we have to be able to place bets across the area. So I mentioned earlier, not just looking at kinetic solutions, but also non-kinetic solutions. I think it is looking at whether it's defeat or offensive solutions as well, knowing that there is no single silver bullet, so to speak, against this type of threat.
Yeah, that's definitely an ongoing debate we've seen in some of the online publications. Caitlin Lee had a left of boom going after the operators, and then in Ukraine you've seen using tools like DJI's Aeroscope that helps to track in real time where the different drones are and where the human that is piloting them is, or the Wind Talker, which was a DIU-backed system that was donated to them. That has been a big part of the counter drone fight going forward. I'm going to bring in another online question, then turn back to the in-person audience. Dan is hitting on something that you had mentioned about joint, and everyone's going to need to be able to defend against small UAS. And with JCO in the lead, how is the Army coordinating efforts across the services to counter this threat and to avoid duplication?
It's a great question. And so it's important first to keep track of what JCO's role is. When the Joint Counter UAS Office was established about 4 or 5 years ago, there wasn't a whole lot of maturity in the department's approach to this particular threat. And so the focus of the JCO was essentially to take stock of what existing solutions existed in the market, what could be matured over time, what the different services were doing, and to assess the state of not only technology, but also the threat as it was evolving. So one of the things that they've done very effectively for the department the last several years is kind of been the tech scouter for solutions in this space. And I think they've done a very good job of that. Once they identify those range of solutions, it's up to the services to be able to invest in those capabilities. And as I said earlier, Army, we've done $1.8 billion from FY17 to the present along those lines in various programs of record and directed requirements. In addition to that, I think it's important to coordinate across the department. And I give credit, at the same time that the JCO was developed, there was a counter-UAS working group that was chaired by the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, Dr. LaPlante, and is also co-chaired by the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. And that team has worked very, very effectively to kind of keep pace with the threat as it evolves and to align some of the efforts across the department in that way. So as you know, OSD has R&D sources of funding to place bets on future maturation of technology, as well as helping to amplify and support some of the more near-term procurement needs that the Army has. That effort includes all of the services. And I think most recently, there's been an effort to maybe kind of expand the focus of some of these working groups, whether it's a warfighter SIG on counter-UXS capabilities to look at other domains and bring in what some of the other services are doing. I think that's a great idea. And I think it just really brings even more technology into the conversation.
Yeah, it's always a thorny problem across the department, across the services, to think about what level of coordination is actually needed, because there are different requirements for each one. What works for the Army is probably not going to be exactly what works for the Navy or the Air Force, but at the same time, you want to be mindful of what's going on so you can leverage the technologies that the others have and be mindful. Conserve resources. Basically.
And there are problems that all services have. I mean, fixed site locations, that is a common problem across the Department of Defense. So if there are both kinetic and non-kinetic solutions to that, we want to make sure that that's as promulgated as possible.
Other questions from the in-person audience in the back?
Thank you very much, sir. Matt Carey with the Lexington Institute. Are you very bullish about active protection systems being able to protect combat vehicles?
So I think that this is an area that the department and certainly the Army has made a lot of investment for many years. I have seen that technology mature considerably in the last 5 to 7 years relative to what we were discussing maybe 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when I was in Army acquisition in a prior administration. So I do see that the evolution of that capability is improving. I also would note that the Army is making investments in some of these areas, particularly for some of our platforms that would be in combat operations in the future. So for example, about almost a year ago, as we looked at the future of the Abrams main battle tank, we made the decision to shift investment from another kind of incremental upgrade to a different ECP, the M1E3 program. And what this will include is, for example, a native active protection system built into the design, recognizing that there are a range of solutions that are now getting to the point that they're mature enough to be able to be integrated onto that platform. So that's just one example across the board, but we'll certainly be exploring that capability on the range of platforms that we employ.
So I think from Jana online, I might be mispronouncing that, has 2 questions that are related to the Army working with startups for countering UAS. How can startups go about it, but also raising the point that there's often a reticence on the part of commercial companies to work with DoD due to potentially triggering ITAR or other things that will restrict their potential markets. How's the Army addressing these concerns and more generally going about trying to work with commercial industry?
Yeah, I think this is an area that I think we can always do better. And I think that we want to encourage that innovation in the industrial base. We love the advent of non-traditional vendors and commercial suppliers to kind of enter this market. We recognize that there are probably barriers to entry, not the least of which could be ITAR restrictions, it could be intellectual property concerns, it could be the rate at which the department receives funding to be able to buy some of these solutions, which is not, I would say, predictable every single time. So I think all of these create some compounding challenges that can sometimes seem to be insurmountable barriers to entry. My response to that would be, there are a lot of things that we're doing in the Army to try to overcome that. I think first, recognizing the JCO has done a great job to do the tech scouting that I described earlier. But I think one of the other things that we've done is, for example, if you look at our counter-UAS programs of record, MLIDs and FSLIDs, they are structured in such a way that the PEO in the Army has the opportunity to upgrade and do subsystem competitions for a lot of the components of these systems. So, for example, over the next couple of years, those programs are planning on doing competitions for a new next generation C2 system that I would describe earlier that would upgrade or perhaps replace FAD C2. There are potential competitions for a new low-cost interceptor to get at either improvements to the range of what we currently employ today, or find ways to reduce some of the cost curve that we discussed earlier in the discussion, as well as finding other solutions that could be brought to bear against this problem set. So we have the programmatic hooks to get there. What I would say is we need to understand what those solutions are out there if we don't already know what they are. So come talk to us. I think whether it's PEO missiles in space, whether it's Assistant Secretary Doug Bush, whether it's the JCO, whether it's me, we want to hear what industry and these non-traditional vendors have to offer.
Great. Questions from the in-person audience? Yeah, Ashley.
Hi,
Hi,
Ashley
Ashley.
Murphy with Breaking Defense. I wanted to ask you about the proposal sort of floating on the Hill, maybe makes it into the House NDA version, about a drone branch, counter UAS and UAS. Any initial thoughts on pros, cons of that?
Yeah, so I did see the language in the initial draft of the House bill, and I would say that it's animated, I think, by a recognition that this is a very real threat. It is a problem set the department and the Army in particular have to confront, and so we, as we've talked about for the last several minutes, share that urgency, and we definitely share that focus. How you go about it, my view is that creating a core or other institutional kind of structures to kind of get after it, in some ways could take away some focus from some of the things that we just talked about that we're actually doing. It's important, in my view, to get after giving units these COTS UAS capabilities to let them experiment. I want to better understand the TTPs about how they're going to employ them at different echelons, and to be able to understand how that affects the way that our formations will fight. So things that we're doing like transformation in contact or some of the experiments that we're performing today are critically important. I think the institutional implications of it to me are secondary at this point, as opposed to figuring out how we're going to employ the technology, what technology works the best, and most importantly, do we have our buying processes in place in order to be able to get there. Having a branch or a COE or anything like that, it's not going to help us buy anything faster or get us more resources against this problem set.
Yes.
Hey, Sam Scope.
Hi, Sam.
So the idea of using operational funds to buy more COTS is a really promising idea. That said, Army brigade commanders are working with limited funds and operational budgets. Not everyone is going to be so excited about drones based on their background or operational experience. Are there ways that you've thought about incentivizing brigade commanders buying those drones, either extra dollars for the operational budget or Army leadership, incentivizing that in some way? Yeah, anything you have on that would be great.
Yeah, it's a great question, Sam, and we have. So in the 25 budget submission, we actually put in about $25 million, for unit O&M operating funds to be able to buy off of this common hardware systems contract that I alluded to earlier. In addition to that, as part of these experimental efforts in transformation and contact, we're putting in more or realigning some money to be able to enable some of these units that are being used for experimentation purposes to get at some of these commercial solutions. So I think combined, you're going to see in execution, both this year and next year, a significant uptick in the availability of funds. But the biggest challenge has been units have had to figure out how to do this on their own. I went to Hawaii last year, and I got to see what 25th ID was doing on their own with existing funds, because they recognized that this is where the future was going. So I think the incentives are already largely in place. All we're doing is removing barriers and giving them resources.
Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, Rob Innig, Pounds here. Hey, thanks for the talk. One of the things you mentioned, which we've seen a lot in Ukraine, is this disaggregated decision making, where you have these sort of autonomous or independent units really like 4 guys in a pickup truck, right, going out and moving targets through the kill chain on their own at really enhanced speed. However, maybe not tied into the broader C2 picture as much as we typically do. I'm curious how you think our version of that, where we're able to, I know the Army has disaggregated command posts and this effort to disaggregate decision making. How do we do that, but also tie these things into the broader C2 picture?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what the Army is focusing on right now as we are adapting the way that we operate to a division level unit of action. And so recognizing which decisions, kind of have to be concordant with kind of the broader higher echelon strategy and how much kind of distributed decision making we want to allow, lower echelons to be able to employ. There's a lot of work being done right now in the Army in that space. I think the real factor for us is the pace of, kind of the technology and how it's evolving. I think it's largely there. I think part of the limitations to that is going to be, the network transport to be able to enable some of that decision making and autonomy, as well as, our ability to buy and scale out some of those solutions in a deployed environment. I do think both of those will be overcome, and so I think I'm excited to kind of see how that continues to evolve.
So I'm going to take the prerogative here, and we've talked a little bit about what we've seen in the FY25 budget request. But can you give us a hint on where the Army is planning to go, since we know you're already working on FY26?
Sure. I mean, I cited the amount for the last several years combined to recognize or to kind of signal that this is not a new area of investment for us. But certainly as we look at the threat, as we look at the continued demand for both kinetic and non-kinetic solutions against these UAVs, I think you will see a significant investment as we're putting together the next budget for 26. I'm largely involved in that right now in the Pentagon, and it's something that's top of mind for Secretary Wormuth, General George, myself, Vice Chief of Staff, General Mingus, and others as we're looking how this budget comes together. And it's not just an overall dollar level that matters, although that does matter. I think it is where we are placing the investment too. So, this is a big year as we're going from 25 into 26 in terms of maturing, for example, directed energy solutions like high-powered microwaves, 4 prototypes delivered this year that we can continue to mature and perhaps get to the point where we put into some type of operational environment. And what those high-powered microwaves enable us to do is to defeat, swarm threats. Certainly there are DE solutions, whether it's the DE M-SHORAD mounted on the Stryker. There is IFPC high-energy laser, which has the promise of a 300 kilowatt laser as part of our layered air defense architecture. There's a lot of bets that we're placing that we're going to continue to fund that investment. But I would just also kind of note that within the existing programs of record, there are some things that we can do, even at the subsystem level, to improve the range of counter-UAS capabilities. And so that continues to be my area of focus.
Yeah, clearly there needs to be consistency over time to make sure that you actually move from the R&D into fielding, and then fielding it at scale and in the numbers that are really going to be needed, whether you're talking about drones for ISR or strike or counter-drone systems. That sometimes can be challenging, especially when you're facing budgetary caps and there are a lot of competing priorities and coming to fruition, competing programs that are coming online at the same time. So I'm going to raise one question that is a bit, I think, uncomfortable, but really important for the Army to be thinking about in terms of the type of drones that it's acquiring and how it's going to use them. We've seen across the board there have been a number of different American drones that have been given to the Ukrainians, and in general there have been a number of problems with all of them where they haven't performed as had hoped or had expected. And a lot of this was due to either the GPS jamming or the communications jamming. So what's the Army doing to ensure that you're actually, the capabilities that you're investing in terms of drones are ones that are going to be resilient enough, but also not so exquisite and expensive that you're going to only be able to afford a handful of them?
That's a great question. What I would say, that's true on both sides that we're seeing in Ukraine. So the mass use of low-cost UAS systems by both sides has its limitations in such a contested and congested EW environment. So that's true of both. The way that both are overcoming this is with mass. And so the ability to achieve effects by having such low cost capabilities that you're able to flood the zone, that is what I think you're seeing essentially a new type of trench warfare in Ukraine from that perspective. I think for us, that gives us a couple of different insights. I think as we look ahead to how we're investing in UAS systems, it is about finding the right sweet spot between which systems have to be hardened to what degree, recognizing that it is that cat and mouse game that I alluded to earlier, and how much the low-cost, attritable nature of what we're buying is part of the solution set. And then lastly, I would just say that, again, whether it's the mission is to have EW effects on the battlefield offensively for us, whether the mission is to provide surveillance and reconnaissance, we have to, as an Army, rely on a range of sources. We are not exclusively dependent on the UAS capability to provide that. It is an additive capability, but we're never going to get past some of the longer sensing and ISR solutions that the Army continues to rely on, some of which are in the Joint Force, as well as from a kinetic standpoint, the other things that we have in the arsenal, whether it's indirect fires, et cetera, that are a key part of how the Army is going to operate. So I think having the range of investment across everything that the Army has to do, that's got to be our continued focus.
Yeah, having that balanced portfolio. The drones aren't replacing artillery. They're not a substitute for anti-tank guided weapons.
Correct.
Every weapon has its place. So we only have a few minutes left, but I would like to turn to the Pacific and think about what we've seen in Ukraine. The Pacific is obviously a very different theater, and if we're considering the pacing challenge of China, a very stressing scenario for U.S. forces. How is the Army, and I know General Flynn out there in the Pacific is thinking about this, sort of imagining how drones might play into potential conflict there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the application is a little bit differently, but I also think that at the same time, there are limitless opportunities for drone technology to play an important role in the Pacific. First, to the extent that any forces are employed in that region, understanding the availability of surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities, and how important it is against a high-end fight, and how it would be employed given the EW challenges we discussed earlier, that's a top consideration. I also think that in the area, for example, for the Army, of contested logistics, where you have autonomous systems that can perform resupply, intra-theater lift, those kinds of capabilities are going to be really important for the role the Army is going to play as part of the Joint Force. And so I give a lot of credit to Army Futures Command, the contested logistics cross-functional team that's based in Huntsville. They're doing a lot of work, experimentation, and analysis in this area to figure out, as that market continues to evolve, how can it change the footprint of what the Army relies on in terms of systems and how it operates in that theater. The tyranny you have there is a very sophisticated potential adversary, and you have the tyranny of distance. And so overcoming that and employing these technologies has to fit within that context. But I see a lot of application.
Yeah, those are excellent points. Clearly, logistics and being able to support dispersed forces over the hundreds, if not thousands of miles in the Pacific is one of the biggest challenges. And you are seeing the Ukrainians are starting to do that on a smaller scale with their heavy multi-copters delivering to the front lines. So that is one area to look forward to. Well, I think we're running out of time, so we're going to wrap this up.
Okay.
Thank you so much, sir,
Thank
for
you.
joining me. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for everyone who joined in person and who was online.